Hello and welcome to the next video blog of the Weichert Report. My name is Brandon Weichert, and I'd first like to apologize for yet another gap in between my previous video blog and this one. It's unfortunately, for those who don't know it is the holiday season, Thanksgiving through to Christmas and New Year's in the United States, so it becomes a bit more time consuming and difficult to produce always these vignettes on geopolitical situations. The drinking light is on tonight, but the smoking lamp, unfortunately, is not. The drink of choice tonight is a nice Johnny Walker Black. The initial desire was to have a single malt, my preferred Macallan. Unfortunately, I realized before doing this that I ran out, and in the state of Virginia, apparently, at least around here, my liquor stores are not open at this point in time. Regardless, Johnny Walker Black is a fine Scotch. I recommend it for everyone. And when you don't have a lot of money to spend, the double black is very good as well. Earlier tonight, in fact, I was offered by an old friend of mine a bottle of the new limited edition Macallan number 2 or something. It's the orange bottle. Everybody's making a big deal about it on social media, and as soon as I was told that it was made with jasmine, vanilla, and ginger, I politely declined. I'll stick with what I know until I find something better, and I don't think a Scotch Macallan, no less, with ginger, vanilla, and jasmine is necessarily something that I would enjoy. So, the Kuril Island Dispute is what brings me into your homes and offices tonight. As you know, the Kuril Island Dispute was the actual first thing that I wrote about for the Weichert Report. I have followed the Russian pivot to the Far East going back to 2009 and 10. I'm very much intrigued by tripolarity, the relationship between the United States, the People's Republic of China, and the Russian Federation, and the interplay there, going back to the Cold War, obviously, most famously. And tonight, with the Kuril Island Dispute, what brings me is, in the first article at the Weichert Report, I posited that President Vladimir Putin was listening to a man that has been dubbed by Foreign Affairs as Putin's brain, Alexander Dugin, who is the father of Neo-Eurasianism, which is an ideology that basically demands Russia reassert its dominance over its former lost lands around its periphery, particularly in Europe, that it seeks to prevent the so-called Atlanticist powers, the seafaring powers, the United States primarily, from creating alliances along the Russian periphery. It calls for the establishment of a Eurasian economic community or union, Eurasian Economic Union. It calls for stabilizing relationships with both China as well as Japan and several of the other Asian states. Mr. Putin is also he and his inner circle of advisors are what's known as Siloviki, and these are former Soviet Union era Russian geostrategists and foreign policy makers and intelligence people who all believe that Russia must pivot back to the east, reassert its dominance in the east by playing nice, basically, with the Chinese and creating a new kind of access between Moscow and Tokyo, if possible. In the article, in our first maiden article, I posited the notion that Vladimir Putin was going to try to settle the Kuril Island Dispute, which has been plaguing Russo-Japanese relations since 1945. Basically, the Kuril Islands there are 4 islands in dispute. They're at the northern tip of Japan. And if you think about it as stepping stones, and they're not that large, these islands, but they do have people living on them, and they've had them for centuries. If you think of them as stepping stones, though, they go from Japan, and you could look at them on a map going all the way up, not very far, to the bottom of what's known as the Kamchatka Peninsula. The Kamchatka Peninsula is at the very end of Russia. It is on the other side of the Bering Sea. So when Sarah Palin, for instance, famously was accused or misrepresented by Tina Fey in 2008, hilariously so, of seeing Russia from her backyard. The part of Russia that she was seeing was the Kamchatka Peninsula. It's an area that it's also familiar to Risk players. It's part of the territory there. But there's been a lot of talk in the last 12 months to 2 years, really, about Russia reasserting dominance in the Kurils. You see, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they pretty much let their Far Eastern holdings go. In fact, there's a great instance when Vladimir Putin was very early on in his reign, I think in the year 2000 or 2001, he went out to the largest town in Russia on the border with China and basically gave a speech that said that if the Russians there didn't start doing more to build up their community, i.e. having more babies, that the Chinese primarily, but also Koreans, Japanese, and others would literally overwhelm them with greater population density. In fact, what we're seeing right now is Chinese are flooding into places like Siberia, the so-called wild east of Russia. And they are basically moving in there, and anybody who knows anything about that part of Russia understands that, and I'm happy to inform those who don't, understand that the Chinese who are moving into that part of Russia are doing so explicitly at the urging of the Chinese government, and they're also there not as Chinese seeking to become Russians, but as Chinese seeking to reclaim lost territory. Not unlike what La Raza says they want to do with the American West vis-a-vis Mexico. But I digress. So there's been this pivot going on since at least 2010. They've been talking about it. Around that point, shortly after the Georgian War in 2008, Putin started to seriously try to reconnect with the Russian Far East. Most people wrote it off. But I've been following it since then, and our maiden article looked at the Kuril Island dispute because it is probably one of the longest, I would say, ongoing disputes that Japan has. And it's an outstanding dispute because it predates the end of the predates the end of the Second World War, in that the Russians, toward the last few months of the war, when Germany surrendered, they started to pivot their forces back to the east to fight the Japanese, which of course had not surrendered. The United States was the primary allied combatant in the Pacific theater, and the Russians had played a very nominal role there. They were too preoccupied with Germany. The Russians came storming in. They took the northern part of Korea, which is why we have North Korea today, as well as a litany of other surrounding areas, including the Kuril Islands. The Kuril Island dispute has gone on since the days of Stalin. The Russians administer the island. They control it. It's theirs for all intents and purposes. In the same way, and I'm gonna annoy some Chinese with this, in the same way that the Senkakus, or the Diaoyus, as China calls them, are in fact Japanese islands, because Japan administers those islands. Under international law, you can make a claim that territory is yours if you can prove that your government is paying and has been administering those lands for X amount of years. And so, anyway, in the case of the Kuril Islands, Russia, since 1945, has administered those lands. The people who live on the Kuril Islands are Russians. They may be ethnically Japanese, in many cases they are, but they are Russian citizens. And in 2013 or 12, I'm forgetting now, then President Medvedev of the Russian Federation flew famously. I think he was the first leader since Stalin to have flown to the Kuril Islands to basically reassert Russian authority there. As I said, Russian authority, military presence in the Far East was withering on the vine as their population density in Russia is contracting. Or contracts. So, there's been an uptick of Russian interest in reasserting their dominance over those lands. The Japanese of late, of the last couple years, have also been deploying fighters and doing patrols with their self-defense naval forces around the islands, I think, to try to indicate to the Russians that they are not ceding on the claim at all. The Russians, in the last year and a half, have begun doing multiple significant things. First among them is they moved their bastion, the massive, I think it's the S-300, S-400 missile air defense systems, the same air defense systems that took out the F-117 stealth fighter in Bosnia in 1999. These things are lethal. They're the same ones that the Russians are giving to the Iranians, which is causing many U.S. Air Force personnel a great degree of dyspepsia, because these things are very effective against current U.S. Air Forces. Russia has also, in the last 6 months, they have announced that they're going to look into trying to build a deep water port for their reinvigorated Pacific Fleet. They have restationed a whole boatload of troops on the island. They're really fortifying those islands in an attempt to solidify their Far Eastern periphery. I posited, though, based on my reading of neo-Eurasianist ideology, which insists on amicable relations with, among others, but notably the Japanese, which is a new thing for Russian history because traditionally, going back to the Tsars, the Russians and the Japanese have been bitter enemies. Remember the Russo-Japanese War, in which the upstart Japanese Empire utterly decimated the famed Russian Pacific Fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. The Russians even deployed their Baltic fleet. They moved them from the Baltic Sea around the Horn of Africa and shot them up to basically take out the Japanese fleet near Korea. It was a battle. The Japanese were trying to push the Russians out of Port Arthur, among others, in the northern part of the coast of Korea. And the Japanese defeated both Russian fleets severely. And that, of course, was the war in which Teddy Roosevelt won his Nobel Peace Prize because he brought the two sides to the yacht and negotiated a settlement. But that going back to then, Russian and Japanese relations have been strained, to say the least. So the issue is, when the Weichert Report launched, our first article was detailing what I've just detailed, and I also asserted that I believed the Russians were going, despite the over-militarization of the islands on their part, and the fact that the Japanese under Abe, being very nationalistic, very conservative, they neither side appeared willing to compromise on this issue. I said that if you know Neo-Eurasianism, and if you believe that Vladimir Putin listens to Alexander Dugin, which of course he does, that Putin will make a deal with the Japanese. And the Japanese are going to want to make a deal as well, because the last thing the Japanese want is to have to deal with a reinvigorated China, rogue North Korea, and then also now an increased Russian newly modernized military presence coming into their part of the woods. And they don't think they can depend on the United States. At least under President Obama, they've not felt that they could. So that was the context. Basically, I argued, and then I submitted articles to the New York Times, the Financial Times, and to the Foreign Affairs on this, and they all laughed me out of the room. And that's why I made an article on the Kuril Island dispute. But basically now the Financial Times this week launched an article, a very, very well done article, but frankly, if you had been reading the Weichert Report, you would have known all of this months ago. They launched an article in which they detailed that, hey, look, it would appear that there might be a chance to settle the Kuril Island dispute amicably. I think that this is an interesting prospect, to say the least. So I don't think Russia is going to give up their claim to the island. Putin being a Siloviki, Putin being a nationalist, Putin believes that Russia's future is actually to the east. And this is why he's become so buddy-buddy with the Chinese. This is why he's doing what he's doing. He's basically playing nice because he wants to take part in the dynamic economy of the Asia-Pacific. And his coastline is on the Asia-Pacific. His problem is he doesn't have the infrastructure to get people out there very well. And also, they don't have the population density, which is why he's going around trying to annex all these ethnic Russians and trying to bring all these former, Soviet and Russian imperial citizens back into the Russian fold with the Eurasian Economic Union. I don't know how successful he'll be, but he's going to try. He's going to give it the old KGB best. So, I believe that Donald Trump, now being president, he seems to have a very amicable relationship with Shinzo Abe, despite fears that he was going to be anti-Japanese. He also has made comments that he wants to have a friendlier footing with Russia, and that he wants to reassess what exactly America's interests are vis-a-vis Russia. There's also, as we've documented, I'm very proud of the work we've done at the Weichert Report. We're really at the cutting edge of following this anti-globalization trend going throughout the world. There is the rise of nationalism, which it's good and it's also not good. Don't buy the dogma in the press, though. There's some benefits to that as well. But essentially, what you're seeing is Abe and Putin are both nationalists. And actually, Abe, I think, likes and respects Vladimir Putin. Donald Trump is a nationalist. Not of an ethno-religious variant, of an ideological Andrew Jackson sort of American version of a nationalist, which is very different from the European and the rest of the world's version of nationalism. But anyway, Vladimir Putin, Donald Trump, Shinzo Abe all have things in common. They're strong leaders. They both want their due. They both feel, all three of them feel that their interests are being, that they need to refocus their interests. And so, toward true national interests. not toward these kind of amorphous concepts. So I think the Japanese are getting ready to make a deal with the Russians over the Kuril Island dispute. And I think Donald Trump, or the incoming Trump administration, if it isn't planning to, it should help usher in this deal. Here's why. Russia has a limited capability to deal in its Far East. If the Trump and Abe, if they can tag team the negotiations, I think we can create a situation where Japan saves face. They create a new status of the Kuril Islands where they renounce the claims to it in exchange for a treaty of some kind or a promise that Russia will not back China in the South China Seas disputes, in the ongoing Chinese dispute with Japan over the Senkaku Islands. You see, in 2001, the Vladimir Putin and then Chinese President Jiang Zemin signed a treaty of cooperation and friendship, in which, people don't know this, many people, Putin vowed in the treaty to send the Russian Pacific Fleet to block any American military attempt to intervene against China should China decide to invade Taiwan. The United States has a mutual treaty defense pact with Taiwan. Taiwan is our ally. They are, as Bruce Hershenson calls, a threatened democracy. They must be defended at all costs. So I think one way we could do it without having to actually go to war, Jiang Zemin and the Chinese negotiators, in their deal with Russia, negotiated a sunset clause. I believe it's 2020 or 2021. That treaty is set to expire. It's coming up. It's only 4 years away. It's coming up. So I think there's a way that Trump, backing Abe's play, says, look, give the Russians these 4 islands. They're specks. Fine. Let them have it. In exchange, we get them in writing to promise that they will not back any Chinese attempts at revanchism in the South China Sea or the Greater Asia Pacific. That's a good idea. That's a good way to use diplomacy. I think right now it can't happen. I think that right now the current administration in America is so checked out of what's going on that they can't be depended on, and nobody really cares. But I think that with Trump, and like I said, the 3 men in question have a lot in common. I think that there's a deal to be made. And maybe America could step in and promise to assist the Russians developing the Kuril Island natural gas resources. I don't know. That the details of that would have to be worked out by the far more capable hands who are professional diplomats at the State Department. But bottom line, I believe that Russia is acting according to neo-Eurasianist principles, which means that they have to make peace with the Japanese, and I believe that the Japanese right now are looking to take some of the heat off. They don't want Russia operating in tandem with China and North Korea. That's just they can't have that. Russia right now, of the 3, Russia is the quote-unquote weakest because they don't have the kind of footprint in that part of the world that either China or to a lesser extent North Korea has, just because of geography. Ideally, we would never have to worry about Russia in the Pacific. Unfortunately, the reality is they're going to have a hand there. If you look at the long-term trends going on in Russia, unless Putin can secure a certain number of people If he can bring a certain number, like the reason he wants Ukraine is he wants all those people as well as the fertile land. It was Ukraine was once the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. He needs basically he needs more people in Russia, and he's I think it was he's offering 100,000 or maybe even more to pay basically Turkmen to uproot and move to Russia's far east under the imprimatur of Russia to buffer the explosion of Chinese immigrants and Japanese immigrants. Another part of the deal could be, by the way, Russia is desperate to get Japanese investment in the Russian Far East. I think one part of the deal could be that Japan, in exchange for this, will help them develop as best they can. Again, I'm dubious of Russia's ability to develop the Far East. They've never been able to develop it beyond what they have now. Now, Irkutsk, I can never say it right. Irkutsk is a very beautiful place, but and it is a cosmopolitan, beautiful city. But that part of Russia is not going to be able to have the same potency that the Moscow side of Russia, the side that borders Europe, will have or has. They don't have the appeal, they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the ability, and frankly, China is far too dominant on that side of the Eurasian landmass. So it's really not that big of a loss for the United States to push for a settlement of this conflict, especially if we can bring Russia to the fold. If we can bring Russia to if not a friendlier position on the Pacific, then a less adversarial, more neutral one. The treaty of friendship that Putin signed with China, I know everybody laughs it off because when it was made, Russia was not the dominant force that it has become. It should worry us because I really think, and I've got articles forthcoming on this on the Weichert Report, but I do really believe that that China is in the next 4 to 5 years going to be making some big moves to try to reclaim Taiwan. And if they do it when this treaty is still enacted between the Russians and the Chinese, and with tensions being the way that they are, and Putin feeling slighted by the West, this might be a way to save face for everyone. And it's certainly a hell of a lot cheaper than going to war, which seems to be the modus operandi of everyone today. Well, it's always been, but anyway. So the bottom line here is, I do believe that there are signals going on that there will be a Kuril Island Dispute settlement, and I think it will have to be in Russia's favor. But there's always room for negotiation. But I don't think it's the end of the world that Russia would get this settlement. I'm much more concerned about Russia in Ukraine than I am in Russia in the Far East. So I think that this would be a great place to start for the Trump administration going in the first 100 days. This might be a quick, easy win, relatively easy. And it's a place that most people don't think about regarding Russia. We think about Russia and Turkey. We think about Russia and Syria now. We think about Russia, obviously, in Eastern Europe. We don't think of Russia in the Pacific. So these are some things to look out for. And, of course, there's a lot of money to be made. So for my investor friends out there, if this is coming, I would have some money on the standby to start investing for the inevitable oil, natural gas, primarily development deals that are to be made from this new thing, as well as from the pending, what I believe will be inevitable massive surge of Japanese investment into Russia's Far East. Basically, Putin wants to try to make Russia's Far East kind of like a Silicon Valley. I don't know if that's going to work, but he thinks the Japanese are going to be a key component of that new vision. So, who knows? But dispute settlement's coming, I think. Russia's probably going to walk away with this. America needs to come involved, Donald Trump's administration, because this current administration does not have what it takes. Donald Trump needs to come in, use his pull, I think, to try to get like-minded nationalist Abe to make this deal will make it worth their while, and at the same time we could be able to potentially mollify the Russian bear in the Far East, which would be a big monkey off our back vis-a-vis the Chinese and North Korean situations. Who knows, maybe we could even get them to help out with North Korea, though I am not sanguine about that. I mean, Russia, unfortunately, Russia is to the United States what France was to Great Britain for, 400 years almost. A constant spoiler. We can work together on a lot of issues, but we're always going to be sizing each other up. And China, all due respect, I have nothing against the Chinese people. They're great, and it's a very rich history. But the Chinese government is, unfortunately, I think, their economy is the bubble's going to burst, I think, and they're going hyper-nationalist, hyper-military, because they're going to do everything they can, the Chinese Communist Party, to stay in power. So they're going to be very aggressive and bold the next 4 to 5 years, and we need to be ready. So we don't need to be picking fights with Russia in the Far East on top of dealing with both China and North Korea. Well, I hope your Thanksgiving was great. Mine was fantastic. We traveled. It was wonderful. Took the whole family down to the South in America, the American South, where I grew up, and had a great turkey meal. Came back, and we're now getting ready for the Christmas holidays, as you can tell by the Christmas tree in my office. So, Merry Christmas. If you're not Christian, you don't believe, Happy Holidays, whatever it may be. For the Weichert Report, I'm Brandon.